Quick question to those of you who have joined already, and we've got 3 minutes on the countdown roughly. Give me a heads up on what the sound sounds like, because my normal method has just failed, so this is the backup. So just give me a heads up if it sounds all right. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining this afternoon's live stream. For those of you who were involved in the sound check a second ago or a few minutes ago, thanks for that. Typically what happens is I'm joining via the Rode system, but for some reason it wouldn't connect today. And the way to fix that would be to quit out of the live streaming software and start again. But if I do that, then it would kill the stream. So we're on the backup solution, which should in fact actually be slightly higher quality. But if it peaks a little bit or is too quiet, just give me a shout. But so far so good. Anyway, that's enough of that. Today we are going to be looking at some editing fundamentals. We've spoken about a lot of fancy stuff as late, AI masking, match look, people masking, etc, etc. But of course none of that is useful if we avoid the fundamentals or the basics or whatever you want to call it. And I've done this a few times in the past, but it's been a while since we have done it. So it makes sense to kind of get back to that and talk about some of those things. So that will be a lot of tools which sit in the adjust tab. So the exposure, high dynamic range, levels, curves, possibly the color balance tool, clarity if we get time, and so forth. which might sound very rudimentary and dull and everything, but there's actually some really good stuff in there and good knowledge which is going to be useful. So for those of you on YouTube, welcome. You can interact and ask a question if need be, and I just have to pass some papers to someone. So yeah, for those of you on YouTube, you've figured out how to ask questions. If not, if you look on the right hand side, there's the comment box and you can put questions in there and that will come straight through to me. Also, if you're in our live streaming room, you can ask a question by going into the Q&A tab, and that will go through to me and also to Victor as well. If you don't want to ask a question, you can hide that by clicking the down arrow, and that will give you a bit more space to see Capture One. All right. Sorry for the extended intro, but as I said, give me a shout if the sound is not quite good. That's the wrong button. We want Capture One. Okay, so first of all, we are going to talk about, did I open Mousepose? I can't remember. I think I did. First of all, we're going to talk about the exposure tool, which, as I said, might sound not super interesting, but it actually has some really valid things in there which are worth knowing about. One of those is how exposure relates to brightness. The second is how contrast relates to the curves down here. And the fourth is also how saturation works in relation to this saturation down here. So all of that varies in different ways. And of course, there's better ways to use some of those tools depending on which images you're working on. Okay, so let's start with exposure, contrast, brightness, saturation. And we're going to talk about brightness. So brightness really is probably an underused slider, but also extremely useful in a lot of situations. And today I've tried to pick a variety of different images depending on whether you're a product person, an events, lifestyle person, portraiture or product or whatever, but the same methodology always applies. So if we take this chap first of all, and we're going to pull out the histogram because without that it's going to be tricky. The super unscientific way to think about this demo is to look where the end of the histogram is. You can see it's just kind of above the F, I would say. And we're going to drag the exposure slider because we feel we could brighten up this picture a little bit. So I'm going to just drag that a stop also to the right. Instantly you can see what's happening. The image has got brighter, of course, as you would expect by adjusting the exposure. But I guess the negative effects of it is that maybe our highlights are getting too bright. We've lost some of the detail that's going on in the sky. His shirt is too bright and so forth. So we can, of course, counteract that by pulling the highlights back and so forth. But you might find a simpler, easier way to edit images like the ones I've got here is to bring the brightness slider into play a bit more. And what brightness does, again, if unscientifically we look at where the end of the histogram is, so just above the F, if we pull the brightness across, you see what's happening? That end of the histogram is pretty much stubbornly refusing to go beyond that point. So what's happening with brightness is that we're trying to lock the end of the histogram, if you like, but adjust everything to the left of that, like so. And you can also see, maybe unscientifically again, if we pull up the exposure greatly, you'll see eventually everything is kind of sliding off the end of the cliff. If we drag up the brightness, you see even at my full adjustment, it's far less aggressive. So if you want to brighten an image, maybe it's not the best word, but in some ways it is. You are brightening it, you are not boosting the exposure, then that's a good way to do it, because you might find it's better doing that than fighting exposure against highlights and so forth. One thing I was going to think about, if we drop the exposure, you can see what's happening. If we drop the brightness, similar thing. So you see here roughly, again, unscientifically, the end of the histogram is just in between ISO and 100. So if we pull that down, you see everything falls off the cliff. If we grab brightness down, you can see even at my maximum adjustment, there's some limitation going on there. So generally it can be a better way to deal with these kind of images. So let's take our boot as an example. Let's reset these two things here. We've got a nice bright white top here, and we've got our nice hard shadow. But if we wanted to brighten up the boot a little bit, then if I bring up the brightness, you can see we're, you know, perilously close to the edge here. So any manipulation of exposure is going to push that right off the edge. Whereas if we bring up the brightness a little bit, we could probably even pull down, sorry, not that one, highlights a touch, and brightness. That's going to be safer than trying to boost the exposure. Now, one thing you might like to play around with when you are looking at critical stuff is adding a readout. So that's here, add color readout. So we can stick one of these guys wherever we want. We can actually see, if I zoom in like so, we've got close to 253, 243, 237, but nothing is actually blown out. Now, if we put on our, what do you call it? Exposure warnings like so, then you can now see it pop up. Now, if we go to settings as an example, let's go over here. Now I've got my exposure warning set to 253. So you'll see if I drop that in, then the exposure warnings are going to come in more violently and sooner, if you like. If I go to 255, they're only going to appear when we've actually lost detail. I tend to set it a little bit lower around here so I can see when things are starting to come out of range. And then down here, I've got my enable shadow warning added as well, because by default that's not turned on, which is a bit silly in my opinion, and I have that set around here like so. So let's just reset what we were doing. So that's how it comes out, and you can see the warnings are on because we're above blue channel, at least is at 254. But if I wanted to brighten this a little bit, I'd be far happier using the brightness and doing that kind of thing than messing around with exposure. Same goes for Nathan here, or not same goes. This is a situation where let's reset. Sorry, let's first of all, I'm going to clone this, and then we're going to reset the exposure and high dynamic range. I'm going to turn off my exposure warnings. In this case, what settings is there? So that's a half a stop exposure boost. So here, actually bringing up the exposure gives us a nicer overall result. Whereas if I go to brightness, I don't actually prefer it. So again, there's no hard and fast rules what you should use. You can always experiment with the sliders. But for the most part, if you're trying to brighten an image and you've got some highlights you want to protect, brightness is the way to go. Okay, let's take a look at a quick question break. Yes, we have got this being recorded, so that will go straight out to YouTube as well. So don't worry about that. And I think we're good from questions at the moment. Yes, good. All right, excellent. Hopefully that means you understand everything. That's always good. Right, okay, so moving on. So we've got our exposure tool pretty much wrapped up, or at least exposure to brightness. Let's do saturation first, because that's quite easy and straightforward. Contrast is kind of going to be a bit more involved because we're talking about the curves as well. So let's stick with the boot. Now, if I boost up my saturation, and I'm going to slowly crank it all the way up to the top, like so. Now, yes, if I long press on saturation, you can see before and after. Obviously, the boot has got more saturated, but even at 100, it's kind of within the realms of acceptability, if you like. So it doesn't look awful. It hasn't posterized or anything like that. That's because the saturation slider here is more akin to a vibrancy slider. So parts of the image which already have a higher level of saturation will receive less treatment than those that don't. So that's just to keep everything looking good and in range. So again, if I crank this up to maximum, we can see the saturation boost at the back here. We can see the boot goes up, everything's not too bad. If we go to our color editor and pick the boot itself, I'm just going to go here and then drag up saturation, you see it starts to look kind of interesting, like so. So there's no, if you like, hand holding here. It allows you to go up to a 200 in this case, and there's nothing to stop you actually picking it again and giving it more of a saturation boost and so forth. So the saturation slider here doesn't give you any hand holding. It just allows you to go beyond, if you like, what would possibly look visually acceptable. But if you do want more of a free rein, that's the way to do it. But this one is more like a vibrancy control. Saturation down here is going to be less controlled, if you like, but you have that option. Let's see. Keith had a question. When using the ICC profile curve linear profile, does this generate a histogram of the actual RAW? Yes, it's not based on the JPEG preview. When should you use the linear profile? What Keith is referring to is this one, linear response, like so. I would say it's not something I would use by default. If you're going to use this linear response, notice how flat everything gets. So it's going to give you more work to do. So you're going to have to work a bit harder to extract the amount of contrast that you want to have. If you are especially pedantic about that, that might be the way forward. But it does compress the tonal range, if you like. So then you've kind of maximized what's possible from your camera sensor. But I would not put this on as a default because it's going to give you more work to do. If you're struggling with an image with an enormous tonal range, it might make sense, but it's not something I would personally recommend you do as a default. There was a question up here. Michael was asking from LinkedIn. Hi, Michael. Do we support color checker color swatches for profiling images? We don't, in terms of that there's not a tool built inside Capture One, but there's nothing to stop you using other tools that build ICC profiles and putting them in to Capture One. So not something that is native, but it is certainly possible. Okay, moving on. We are going to talk now about contrast. I would say that's a good way to do it. And then we're going to come back and talk about highlights versus whites and so forth. But that means if we do contrast now, we've kind of ticked off that tool. So let's go to this guy, I would say. Okay, so we're going to try this with a variety of different images. I'm going to grab this one. Let's get rid of our color picker tool. Let's just delete that one. Incidentally, if you're on the add color readout and you click, you can option click to take it away and delete it like so. So let's clone this image a few times. So I'm going to clone this, I'm going to clone that, I'm going to clone it again. So we've got 4 images like so. Whoops, helps if you use the right modifier, shift. And we're going to hide the browser and hide this so we can see what's going on. Right, 4 images. This works with any image, doesn't have to be a landscape. You can try this yourself on the kind of imagery that you're using. So top left I'm going to leave as is. It's got some brightness applied to it but no contrast, and I don't believe there's a curve either. This guy we are going to put in an RGB curve, and we're going to be aggressive to prove a point. So this is not how I would edit it, but I'm just making it aggressive so you can see the difference. Down here we're going to put in a Luma curve to a similar level, and on the right, bottom right, we're going to add in contrast with the contrast slider like so. So what do we got? So this one as before, this one with our RGB curve. What's the first thing you notice between these two? Both a similar contrast change. You can see the S curve there and you can see the S curve here like so. Similar contrast adjustment. We could make this one even harsher if you like, but the main difference is that on the RGB curve we cannot help to increase color saturation at the same time. So by using that RGB curve, then this will happen by default. The saturation will go up. Now with the luminosity curve, we've decoupled, if you like, the effect on color from adding contrast. So in some ways it almost looks like it's desaturated. It's not, it just has contrast added without the byproduct of saturation. Now when looking at this, you think, well, that looks a little bit odd, because when contrast goes up in daily life, so if I look outside now, it's quite nice and sunny and contrasty. Everything looks brighter, better, warmer, and so on. So when contrast goes up, I kind of expect visually that saturation is going to go up too. If it's a cloudy, miserable day like it was yesterday, then I almost have an expectation that everything is flat and colorless. So this looks a bit weird to the human eye. Now over here on the right, we've got our bottom right, we've got our contrast slider. Let's crank that up more. It doesn't look like this, and it doesn't look like that. And that's because the contrast slider is a blend of these two. So it's got a little bit of this and a little bit of that, giving you quite a nice compromise. So if someone comes along and tells you never use contrast sliders, they're rubbish and they make the image look bad, that's definitely not the case with Capture One. Yes, you can get more control using curves, and we've got some great resources on that. And also at the end of March, I'm going to have a guest on, Alexander Sowski, who also Keith, who asked that question, does tend to edit with the linear profile because he finds that gives him more scope, but also does quite a lot of nice work with the curves as well. So I'll point you in the direction for that live stream before the end. But what it does mean is that you can crank this contrast slider without overly messing up saturation, but having a bit more of a natural look compared to a pure luminosity curve. So if we take some other examples, so if we go skin tones as an example, so let's zoom in a bit. If we thought, okay, I want to add some more contrast with a curve, I could do so. But if I was adding, you know, an aggressive amount, then I would start to see saturation increase on the skin tone, which we might not want. And then you could be in a place where you're, okay, I need to tone saturation down and so forth. What you might prefer is to go Luma to add the kind of level of contrast that you want in, and then think, actually, I just feel like having a bit more saturation. So you're kind of decoupling the two different adjustments. So technically you could be more aggressive with your contrast without worrying what's going to happen to the color. And just because you've messed around with a curve doesn't mean you can play with your highlight sliders and stuff as well. That's totally fine. Something like product, again, we've got our bag here. So if I put in, you know, I want to add some contrast, then it is going to shift the color, which we might not want from a product perspective. But we could also mess around with the Luma curve, play around with the saturation until we get to somewhere which we feel is more accurate. Can I use both together? Of course you can, not a problem at all. So we could start with, okay, I'm going to have my RGB curve. That looks pretty good, but I'd like to have a bit more depth down here, but I don't want the color to go crazy. So yes, you could combine the two as well. All right, quick question break. Is there a possibility to use the curve on more than one picture at once? No, not with the curve. So you couldn't, for example, select 4 and do a multiple edit. You could with the contrast slider, for example. So if I'm on these 4 images and I hold down E on my keyboard, no, that's brightness, sorry. If I hold W down on my keyboard, so you see by holding W, I activate something called speed edit, and then I can click anywhere on this image, and then as I drag left and right, I'm tweaking the contrast on each image. Notice this one already had a bunch of contrast in it, so it doesn't reset them all to the same value. It does additive or negative, if you like. So it adds a delta to whatever the value is. But no, you couldn't do that with a curve. You'd have to copy paste. Okay, going back to the questions. Let's see. How did I get 4 images on the screen? That's a good fundamental thing to talk about with this. Make sure you've got this activated, multi-view. So without it activated, you only get the primary, even though I've got 4 selected, like so, it only shows me the primary on screen. But if I turn this on, then I get all 4 images like so, which is great for checking images against each other, looking at a selection, using speed edit, which you just saw, all kinds of stuff. Okay, also with this guy, again, if we use an RGB curve, we're going to boost the saturation on our shrimp friends here, which we might not want, certainly for color critical food work, but if we feel like adding contrast, tweaking saturation and so forth, then you might want to go with Luma. Great. Okay. Moving on. What's next? Checks notes. So we've done that. Let's talk about highlights and shadows. But before that, let's make sure this image is reset. Before that, there was a question from Michael. Slightly off topic, Michael, but I'll allow it. No, Capture One needs a catalog or a session. But you can just open a session and browse over in the library tab. This is a catalog, so I can't show you, but you'll find down here, just where your head was, a section called System Folders, and you can browse your entire system. So just make a session called Browsing Session, and then under System Folders, you can go ahead and find everything you like. So yeah, Capture One in that respect is not a single image editor like Camera Raw. Although we have been playing around with ways to do that, which we did for a special client, which might come out into the public. But yeah, for now, open or create a session, look in the area roughly down here called Session Folders, and then that way you'll be able to just browse your entire system. Okay, highlights and shadows. So this is a very good example of what's going on with this tool. Again, if we open our histogram, this image I don't think has any adjustments on it, so it's fresh out of the camera. If we go over here, you can see we've got, if you like, wrong shortcut, David, we've got very bright area here. You can actually see the numbers are 255, so we've lost all hope of any detail there. Same on the light, shade and so forth on this curtain. So if I zoom back out and pull down the highlights, then we can recover that quite nicely. You'll see the histogram change. Now if we go back over to the marble, we can see some detail here. We've got detail back in the lampshade. If I long press on highlight, you can see before and after, so quite some difference. However, if I long press again, you'll see it's also affecting the brick wall out the back here, the sky, some of the ceiling, the other marble as well, which we might not want. So again, if we look at our histogram, you can see pretty much from here to here, get some changes like so. This kind of top here, if you look, gets some change, but is pretty much sat as the way it is. If we use our whites, observe what happens. Forget about the image at the moment, ignore that, just look at the histogram. If we pull the whites down, you saw all that high level stuff gets compressed and pushed to the left. But most of this doesn't really move. So if we pull the whites down like so, and now you're allowed to look at the image. If I put that back and forward, you can see those brightest areas. If I crank this back and forth, getting the detail back, but very little change to the sky, the marble here, the ceiling and so on. But what it does mean is that we can pull that detail back like so, and happy days. So again, a bit like brightness, I suppose, which has some control over the endpoints. This is what the difference is between whites and highlights. Highlights affects this much, if you like, at the end. Whites affects that much. So to really target your highlight recovery, that's the way forward. Different kind of situation here. Let's reset that. So if we look at our subject here, the sunlight is hitting probably completely blowing that out. Yeah, if we look at the bridge of the nose, nothing on the red channel there. If I look at the numbers, nothing on the red channel there, and so forth. But if I bring the highlights down, we fix that. But we're also darkening the grass in the back. We've pulled down the tonality on the tree. It kind of looks a bit flat now. What we want to avoid is the early 2000s HDR look, which thankfully has mostly gone away now. So if I reset that, but again, if I wanted to pull down just those white areas, pay attention up here as well. If I pull these down, then it compresses that. I might have to bring down the highlights a little bit as well. And then we've got something which is looking much better. Now, is there a bit of clipping? A bit, but this has got a pretty broad range, and we've got some clipping on the right hand side. Could we fix that by pulling down the exposure and then opening the shadows? Maybe, but to be honest, if you were standing there looking at this person with bright sun under a tree, you would kind of expect there to be this kind of level of contrast. So we want to keep some realism in there as well. What about superimposing the histogram on the image? You know what? I would find that super distracting, to be honest, because I either want to look at one or the other. I wouldn't want, you know, a histogram blocking anything on the image itself. So generally, I find you can do without staring at the histogram all the time. And it's more of a case of keeping it to the side eye to make sure nothing untoward is going on there. Yeah, so with this one, I would pull those whites right down. I might even drop exposure a touch, open up shadows, and this one we haven't spoken about yet, but maybe add some clarity. So none of these tools really work alone. There is a need, if you like, to use them in combination and to have a little bit of back and forth as well. Quite often the question comes up, what order should I edit my pictures in? And there is no specific order, I would say. The only thing that I tend to do before editing is kind of crop down to the image I want. That does also affect your histogram as well. So if you imagine for some reason there was a massive specular highlight up here, you could be looking at something on the histogram which doesn't actually exist in your final crop. So you'll see if I move my crop over here, the histogram is quite different to down there. So I tend to crop first because I also find that easier to visualize, if you like, the final image. But beyond that, it's not like I think I must do exposure, I must do highlights, I must then do this, because you'll find there's an interplay between editing. Hope that makes sense. All right, what have I missed? We looked at that, we looked at those. Oh yeah, the other end of the scale, shadows versus blacks. So pretty much the same principle applies, really. I think you will be able to guess what it means. Like the highlights, shadows has a broader effect than blacks, except now at this end of the scale. So if we open up those shadows, you can see what happens. This gets compressed and pushed in this direction, and then the net result is that we brighten the image like so. If I push this up to 100, you'll see the difference. If we do the same thing with the blacks, then it's a different look because we're brightening those darker parts of the image. Again, if we look at this one under the arches, if we do that, we're darkening the brighter parts. If we do this, we're kind of still doing that, but you see the difference is that we're now brightening a lot of the other areas of the image at the same time. So it's really a case of, like, what do I want to do? Do I want to give some lift to just the very darkest blacks, or go in the opposite direction, which we'll look at in a second, or do I want to have a bigger effect over the tonal range? if we look at this particular image, this is from a great guy, Phil Penman in New York. If you like street photography, then you will very much enjoy Phil's work. So if we look at this image here next to his edited JPEG, you'll see here he's got a little bit of, hint as to what's going on in the roof, but he's not going for a full-on extraction of all the data that is possible in the camera. So with great power comes great responsibility, of course. So just because you can do this doesn't mean you should. So pretty much. So even though all that data is there, if you were standing under the archway like that, you wouldn't actually see all of this data with the human eye. So it's also got to look realistic as well. Okay. LinkedIn user. Hi, LinkedIn user. I use the color grading tool to reduce the highlights. Yeah, we'll look at that actually, because that kind of operates in a slightly different way. So let's look at that now. Oh, before that, just to close off this discussion. So if you want to open the shadows in an image like this, of course you can do that. But the danger is if you go too much, it starts to look unnatural. A nice way to give a good bit of shadow contrast is to go in the opposite direction with the black. So if I pull this in this direction, we still get the benefit of our shadow lift, but it doesn't look flat. So there's no reason why these two can't go opposite, and you actually get a really nice looking result from it. Let's see, question wise. We've answered that one. We've answered that. Michael was asking, are there any copy previous for adjustments if I have two similar? Oh, I think Victor answered it. Okay, that's good then. How do you quickly zoom in? Easiest way, pan tool, this one up here, double tap, double tap. So double tap, double tap. That's the easiest way to do it. Or you can actually, I forget the shortcut. It is, what the heck is it under? I can't remember. I think it's dot and comma. There we go. So on my keyboard, full stop and comma is fit screen and 100%. So maybe if we type in fit here, customize viewer, there we go, to fit like so. So there is your, this is a good tip by the way, if you ever can't find a function, just search for it and then helpfully it will be shown up here. So customize viewer, here it is, like so. So zoom in, command plus to fit, comma, 100% dot. You've also got the potential to add your other shortcuts as well. So if you prefer that, you can do so. I find just using the pan tool is the easiest way to do it. Okay. What was I going to talk about? Mental block. We've done that. Oh yeah, the color balance tool, as someone asked on the questions. So yeah, the color balance tool. So if we've got this and then we go out to the color balance tool, you can use it, but if we go to highlights, let's see what actually happens. And let's reset this. So now we're back to the same situation we were before. You can pull the highlights down here and you'll see it also does a similar thing, but you might find we're kind of getting a similar effect to using the highlight slider. If I just kind of do this robotically, you can see what's happening to the histogram. It's compressing a lot of the highlight range. Whereas if I do the whites again, you see it's much more targeted. So it's kind of similar, but not similar, if you like. So I would always try to use these sliders because under the hood, they have a bit more clever engineering in terms of also keeping color accuracy on the shadows and highlights. So when we're recovering a highlight, we want to make sure that the color doesn't do something weird or shift, and the same for the shadows. Now if we go to our shadows and blacks and we do a similar kind of thing, let's Let's move this over here so we can bring up the shadows. But you see it's kind of almost got that milky effect. So it's, again, it's, try to think of the shadow and black slider as recovery. So we're recovering detail. Here we're just kind of brightening to some extent. So we get this milky looking effect, which might be nice for a creative look. But I would say you want to establish a good range before you start playing around with the color balance tool. So I'm contradicting myself by saying there is no order, but something like color balance I would throw in at the end of an image edit on a separate layer. So I, as an example, if we were going to edit this and we wanted to do some color grading, I would make a new field adjustment layer, and then I would start playing around with my, you know, what do I want to do with my colors and so on and so forth. So I would prefer to do that on a layer kind of at the end. Okay, let's drop that back and let's take the color balance tool away, which is a great tool in itself. So if you don't know much about that, read up on it because it's super fun. And now we're going to finish off by looking at levels, because when I've been adjusting all these images, I would generally be looking at the levels as well. Let's reset this and start from scratch. Before we do that, I'm just going to check for any questions. Peter was saying, is it possible to hide any of the sliders in the exposure or high dynamic range tab? No, it's all or nothing, Peter. But I wouldn't want to hide them because, to be honest, I think 9 times out of 10 you're going to be using those sliders, I would hope. Off-topic question, Kareen, are you using your Wacom pen all the time? I'm not actually using a Wacom. It's similar, but it's from, looks the same, Zents. Sorry, I know that's hard to see in a tiny window, but this one's from Zents Labs, which is a different company, similar kind of product with a pen. And yes, I use it all the time. I use it in daily life as well. It's very rare that I actually pick up a mouse because I don't find them super comfortable, and the little clicky click constantly drives me insane. Whereas with a pen, it's nice and silent to work with, and I think ergonomically it's actually more comfortable to hold for long periods. Yeah, so a great fan of using tablets. Right, levels. So let's bring this guy up and think about this image. We have got no detail here and no detail here. So on our levels tool, we have some numbers as well, which are not scary by any stretch, but we have 0, which is black. I'm sure you've figured that out, and 255, which is white. So 0 black, 255 white. So we are looking at, if you like, a popularity contest of the tonal range of this particular image. So you can see it has a fair amount of midtones going on and slightly darker midtones. You'll see this orange line jumping around is where my mouse is currently on the image, but it doesn't really have any bright highlights. It doesn't have any dark shadows. Now with a histogram looking like this, the net result that you might see is that the image will look very low in contrast and flat. If that's the look you're going for, absolutely fine. If that's not the look you're going for, then a very simple thing to do is to hit auto on the levels. And what that will do is bring in the highlights and shadows points to either end. So now we've got different numbers down the bottom here. What does that actually mean? Well, this value here is 209 on the RGB scale. Down here, it's roughly just over 30. So what we're asking Capture One to do is to grab either end of the histogram and stretch it out to the number that's written at the top. So now you'll see as I go back and forth, my output at the top here, the tonal range now gets increased. So we have some proper shadows and we have some proper highlights. So again, the net result of that on the image, of course, is that it looks more contrasty and better and so forth, whereas before it looked relatively flat like so. Now, as I said, if you're going for a flat look, that's fine, but I don't want a flat look for this particular image. Now in the middle here, we can pull this one up and we can change the brightness of the midtones like so. And you'll see this little midtone hump moving back and forth, either getting brighter or darker. Now, the only thing that you have to be mindful of when using levels is that if you start to play around with other sliders, for example, let's also have some of this, then see what's happened now is that I've now cut in to the edge of the histogram, which we don't want to do because what it means is effectively we're clipping data. So if I turn my exposure warning on, I've chopped this chunk of the histogram off, and you can see that in the output that we're now slammed up against the side and we've got a lack of detail in our sky like so. So we've completely blown that out. So you need to be careful that if you're playing around with levels is that you don't do that. Some people do this thinking that they're actually adding contrast, but at the end of the day, you're not. You're just actually ending up with filling up the blacks like so. It doesn't print very well. It doesn't look very nice on screen. If someone's looking on a contrasty display, it will look even worse. So you need to be mindful of just checking back on the levels once in a while to make sure everything is intact. So that's, you know, with only a few adjustments, what did we tweak? Levels and contrast, and that's it. And we've gone from that to that. Now you could argue if I reset that and reset that and reset that, if I chuck in loads of contrast and where's our curves, and I start messing around with the curves, you know, I might eventually get to a histogram that looks similar, but that's using a whole bunch of tools. Just do that in the levels and save yourself a load of work, and just be mindful of those endpoints. I think hopefully I just answered that, Larry. Do you find it easier working with levels as opposed to working with the sliders? I mean, in combination, like some images you won't actually get any benefit from working with the levels. So like, let's take a different example. If I go back to this, see, we've already got a pretty robust histogram there. I'm not going to really gain anything by bringing the shadow and highlight points in because I've got pretty much a very busy histogram with some shadows, some highlights, everything else in between. So even pressing auto here, all it's done is move it in a little bit, but I'm going to be worried about making this worse. So in this image, I wouldn't touch the histogram, the levels at all, sorry. Whereas in other images like this one, if I reset that, this is super flat and hazy. So the very first thing I would probably do on this shot is to hit auto. And now we've got instant improvement. And I would probably add some contrast. I would probably add curve as well, and so forth. Yeah. So this requires more heavy-handedness because it is so hazy. Nice and sharp, but just hazy. Kind of unintentional segue into that. When would we go really hard and use the dehaze tool down here, which I don't use a great deal of, to be honest, because I find it can be a bit heavy-handed, but I will go to it if like my normal tactics don't work. So this is shot through glass, I think, which is why you can see it's got some reflections in it and it's a bit flat. So to rescue that, if I hit auto, I'm going to probably darken the midtones a bit. I'm going to pile in a bit of contrast. I'm going to add some clarity. Where are you? Clarity. I'm going to add a fair chunk of clarity. It's actually a bit cold, so I'm going to warm it up. And at this point, I would say, it's still a bit hazy. So I'm going to add in some dehaze too, and be careful of my highlights and be careful of what's going on with the levels as well. See here, that's completely messed up the blacks by chopping into it. So always need to return and look at that. But now we can go from, you know, something that's pretty flat to something that's quite contrasty. Dehaze is just doing a bunch of stuff together. So it's doing some clarity, it's adding some contrast and yada, 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 and getting kind of quite extensive in that respect, just all in one slider. But as I said, I only go to it if everything else has failed. The last one that we need to mention is two kind of final conclusions. Let's bring that back out. Have I edited this? I don't know. Yes, looks like it. It's just going to need to reset my workspace because I've moved a bunch of stuff around and I don't know where anything is. That's better. Let's crop this down a little bit on constraint, like so. So this particular shot, you see it's already been edited. It's got a layer on it. Let's get rid of that. So if we look at this before, it's kind of fairly flat and so on, and then edited to kind of give a nice result over here. Now the only thing that isn't working for me, and even though it looks all right on the histogram and everything, is that we have lost a bit of detail in the seafoam, ever so slightly. So I can fix that by trying to pull down the highlights, but then I don't like what it does to the sky. I can try the whites, but that kind of messes with the sky a bit as well. So in these situations, it tends to work better with a layer. So if you find yourself fighting with sliders, then just use a layer. Now I got told off this morning because I used an AI mask and someone didn't like the edge that it created. And it was a good reminder that you don't always have to default to the newest and fanciest tools. So for this particular edit, it was a lot easier to make a new filled adjustment layer, zoom into my sea and then decide what I want to do with that. So I'm going to pull the highlights down and the whites. I don't care what it's doing to anything else. So that looks sort of all right. And then I'm going to clear the mask like so, and then I can brush it back in where I want it at varying levels of strength. So if I right click, I've got a relatively low flow, which means the mask I'm brushing back in builds up slowly. So now I can brush along the coast here and then get back what I need in terms of my highlights and shadows. Now I'm not worried about brushing onto the sand because it's not going to make any difference. If I want to have a little bit up under the arch, I can do so. And if I've overcooked it, so if we turn it off and back on, that's probably too much, so I can dial it back like so. So that kind of method is way better than trying to precisely mask it with an AI mask. Again, I said I got told off this morning and someone said, but the edge isn't good enough, but it doesn't need to be good enough on something like this because the adjustment that I'm making has absolutely no effect on the sand here. Same goes with the Great Wall of China here. If we want to select the sky, the AI mask is just maybe a little bit too smart because it can see a little mountain down here in the background. So I could probably do that like so, which gives me that, and I could then fill in those bits as well. But to be honest, if I go away preparing AI mask, if I use the magic brush, the good old magic brush, and just do a little squiggle here, there we go. Now we've got a pretty nice sky selection. So just because we've got new shiny tools doesn't mean that we have to use them all the time. I'm so glad you asked, Axel or Axel. Can you copy all adjustments from image layer to a field adjustment layer? So what you can do is we can go on the image layer and we can right click and we can say move image layer adjustments to new layer, like so. So now they're filled and they're moved up to that layer like so, and the image layer is now reset. So yes, you can absolutely do that, and we added that quite a while ago now actually. So yeah, but it's a very useful feature. Right, so let's spend the last 5 minutes with a couple of questions. Raoul, that's a good question. So that's more complicated. So I'm going to ignore it. No, I'm going to come back to it in a second. How do you display full screen to see the full image? Very easily. That is F on the keyboard. Whoops. So if I press F, full screen, and you can actually hover over to the left and the right to pick up your browser, and then F to go back to full screen. It is under the not sure menu, full screen, enter full screen, right there, like so. So again, if you're not sure where it is, just search for it. But it's really nice for looking at an image full screen, funnily enough. And you might find that you prefer to have, if we right click on this area, you might prefer to have this as white, because it kind of gives you a better idea, certainly if you're going to go out to print as well. So F for full screen. So Raoul said, when do you work with RGB levels rather than a specific red, green or blue? So the only time that you would really want to do that is if you've got, I'm trying to think of a good situation where I'm not going to bamboozle you. There is a good article we wrote on it at some point, and I can't remember the specifics, but in the settings over here under, where are you? Yeah, channel mode, RGB or separate. So this is more if you're dealing with a weird color cast in the image, you can switch to red, green and blue channels. And when you auto, instead of, if you like, autoing to the composite, it will do an auto to the separate red, green and blue. Generally, there's not a massive amount of variation between the channels. If there is, you might find it gives you a better result if you're dealing with some weird color casts. But it's hard to say you must use it here and you mustn't use it there, because it's very much image dependent, but you can experiment with that. Checking over here. Would you use levels with a product image? I'd use levels, Laura, with any kind of image, really. It's not exclusive to a certain kind of photography. Probably the product I've got here is maybe a bad example. Probably not, actually. So if we bring up levels tool, let's just reset all this stuff. So pretty much as it came out of camera, yep. Would I use levels here? Maybe a tiny bit. If we hit auto, what happens? It does bring in the shadows a bit, which might give us a nicer black around the bottom here, but it's super subtle. Here I would just be a little bit mindful that I'm not burning out the top of the tower. But if we look at some other products, oops, wrong button. Probably something a bit flatter like this. Just going to reset everything. So yeah, see, this is actually quite flat because we've got no information here. Again, if that's the look you're going for, that's fine. If we don't want that, if I hit auto levels, I'd probably brighten those a bit, lift this slightly. See, it's probably picking up on a specular highlight somewhere, but I'd be tempted to override that and push that to the edge. So if I look for exposure warnings, yeah, it's probably the edge of the ladder that is making auto not bring that all the way in. And then I would probably throw in a bit of clarity, which we didn't talk about, but clarity is essentially adding contrast, but it's not affecting the shadows and the highlights. So it avoids overuse of the contrast tool, which can start to fill up your blacks, blow out your highlights, but this way you can add contrast without messing up shadows and highlights. So yeah, Laura, I would definitely always use levels regardless of the image. So there's before and after. Again, depending what kind of look you're going for, essentially. If we reset this one, this same sort of situation, it's got a nice tonal range, but I might be tempted to bring that in. These are all relatively similar, but technically, again, if I reset this, I would bring in the levels like so. Just gives us that nice base contrast. How did we get the readout feature. So readout feature is this cursor tool up here. Add color readout. So you can stick these, whoops, helps if you select it. You can stick these all over the place like so. And option click, you can take them away. But yeah, add them at will. You can say always show color readouts, or if not, if you're on a different tool, they disappear. When you pick this back up, they'll appear again, which is actually quite a nice little UI touch that if you don't want them showing all the time, they hide when you go to another cursor tool. So that's this option down here. I think also if you right click, yep, you get an option where if I right click on a readout, you can delete the one. If I right click, I can delete all, like so. So yeah, that's a really nice little UI touch for sure. Okay, last question, and then it's time to go home, I think. Oh, there was a comment about the F option on Capture One. It's slightly different on Windows. So on Windows, it doesn't hide everything. So there's a little bit of difference going on there. If I shoot in JPEG, what are the best controls to adjust? The same ones, but you are really limiting the scope of what you can do. Mostly because on a JPEG image, you've only got 0 to 255 different levels of color. On a RAW file, it could be anything up to more than that, 64,000. So probably not quite that much unless you have a 16-bit camera, but going from 255 levels to 16,000 levels is quite different. So JPEG, you can use all the same tools, but you're going to be restricted on highlight recovery, shadow recovery, white balance changes. You can only do minor tweaks, not large ones. So yeah, it's really not the same level, unfortunately. Is clarity more like curve or edge sharpening? No. So let's finish on that because I didn't talk about much on clarity. So clarity is, so if we just stick with this image and pile in loads of contrast, I'm over exaggerating, but you get the idea. Then our blacks start to fill up. See 111, so we've got virtually no detail, and the highlights start to get, you know, uncomfortably bright. So what clarity does is similar, except we're not affecting our shadows, and again we have to be careful, we're not affecting our shadows and our highlights. So it's kind of happening on the midtones only. So if you want to add contrast but avoid those nasty side effects, then that's the way to do it. Okay, before we have to go, I will just bring this into the screen. So if you go to support.captureone.com, easy to remember, I hope, which will take you to this page, and then go to the Learning Hub and live streams. You're going to see the one I was speaking about earlier, editorial editing with Alexander Sowski. So if you're interested in curves, if you're interested in the linear profile that was asked about earlier, and just general editorial editing, I'd strongly advise showing up to that. March the 6th is when we're going to be talking more about workflow, less about editing. And if you follow this page by clicking this button here when you're signed in, you'll receive an email when any new articles get added. And this way you won't miss out. So that's support.captureone.com, Learning Hub, live streams like so. And don't forget, in the same place, there's loads of tutorials, all the previous live streams. There is one on curves, which someone was asking about deeper, curves and levels masterclass. So if you're new to curves and levels, you can also watch that. It's older, with an older version of Capture One, but the operation of curves and levels has not changed. So that will be just as relevant then as it was today. Great. So thanks for joining me today. Sorry if we couldn't get to all of your questions. There was rather a lot of you and only me and Victor today, so it's hard to cover around 500 people in one hit. So hopefully we did our best. All right. Thanks again for joining me today. And of course, you can always reach out to support if you ever have any ongoing questions, or chat to us on social media. So take care and see you all soon. Bye now.